Hello, my name is Alice Mullen. I'm a field specialist in food and agriculture with the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. This is part 5 of a series called Food Safety, a Marketing Strategy for Farmers Markets. In this session, we're going to talk about keeping food samples safe at the farmers markets, as well as a little bit about value-added products. Free samples of your produce is a great way to attract customers to your booth, as well as showcase how delicious your fresh fruits and vegetables are. Since samples are considered a ready-to-eat food, it's important that you handle your samples safely. So in some cases, when you want to provide samples at a farmer's market, you may need to get approval from the farmer's market or the health department ahead of time. Sometimes health departments have certain regulations about how samples are to be served, so it's important to know how to do that correctly. When preparing your samples, you want to make sure you wash your hands first and then, of course, put on gloves. Again, the gloves provide a barrier between your hands and the ready-to-eat food, which is part of New Hampshire's state food code regulations. You also want to wash your produce in drinkable water and then use clean and sanitized knives, utensils, or cutting boards to cut them up and prepare them. If you should be preparing the samples at the farmer's market, again, you want to make sure you have gloves on, that you either use a tissue or paper or tongs to provide that barrier between your hands and the sample. Now, in both of these pictures, the people preparing the samples have a glove on one hand, and then they're holding the knife with an ungloved hand. And that is perfectly acceptable because the hand that's holding the knife is not actually touching the produce. There could be a problem, though, because sometimes people forget and they'll put the knife down and then they'll pick the produce up with the ungloved hand. So it's probably best to wear gloves on both hands. The other thing that I would recommend is that in the picture on the left, they show people cutting up cucumbers and tomatoes on the same cutting board. I would recommend having 2 separate cutting boards to do that, as well as using a plastic cutting board as opposed to the wood one that they are using. Plastic cutting boards are much easier to clean and sanitize than wood ones. Another thing that you can do to keep samples safe is to serve them in disposable cups or use toothpicks or spoons to serve them. This prevents customers from reaching into a large group of samples and then potentially contaminating them with their hands. The other thing is you do want to make sure you cover them so that you do protect them from flies and dust. When you're putting out your samples, it's recommended to put out just small amounts. You don't want to put out your whole batch of samples because it's going to expose it to that temperature danger zone, and you want to try to keep your samples as cool as possible. You can keep your refills on ice and coolers, and then it's also recommended that if you do have samples, that they're on trays of ice, just again to keep them cool. You also want to label your samples so that your customers know what they're eating and what they're tasting, and then that will enable them to decide what they like and what they'd like to purchase. When giving out samples, it's really important to watch your customers and how they take the samples, especially with children. Most children don't know the correct way to take samples off of tables, so it's important to keep an eye on them and help them and show them the correct way to do that. You also want to make sure that your table is covered by a canopy. This helps to prevent any contamination that might happen from bird droppings or other, if it starts to rain, it also helps to protect your produce and your samples. And then finally, at the end of the day, if you do have any remaining samples left over, make sure you throw those away. They've been out for a long time, and so it's important that you discard them because they may be at risk because of time and temperature abuse. And then it's always nice to provide litter containers for your customers so that they can put the used toothpicks or cups in a litter container and keep the farmer's market area clean. Now, if you look at this picture, you might say, well, this is a great event. Let's have kids learn a little bit more about their food. Let's help them enjoy making a food item and getting to know a little bit more about food. But if you look at this picture, there's a couple of things wrong. And can you spot any of them? So one of the first things I see in this picture is that there is raw fish on the cutting board. It looks like raw salmon, and I'm not sure what else the other fish is next to it. And then also on the same cutting board is the fresh asparagus and some scallions. So I'm concerned that there might be some cross-contamination between that fish and those asparagus tips. The other thing is it's on a wooden cutting board, which is a little harder to clean and sanitize. The other aspect is that the children are all handling the food with their bare hands. Now, it's really hard because you don't know if there was hand washing facilities for the kids to wash their hands before preparing the food. There may have been a petting zoo at this particular farmer's market, and if the kids were petting animals and then preparing food and eating it, that could be a source of contamination for them. The other factor is that young children, elderly, pregnant women, and people with compromised immune systems all are at very high risk for foodborne illness. So this population, these kids are at a higher risk for foodborne illness than healthier adults. So I would really recommend that if you do want to do a food activity with kids, you provide them with some hand washing stations, that you give them gloves to put on before they handle the food, and really monitor what they're doing so that you know that they're preparing food that's safe to eat. If you do want to add value-added products to your stand at the farmer's market, you may need to get your product license or have a homestead license for your food business. In New Hampshire, there are regulations that determine how you can prepare food and sell food to the public. So it's important that you work with your local food inspector so that you know you're meeting those regulatory requirements. Unfortunately, you can't just produce a food, put it in a jar, and then sell it to the public. It does have to meet some federal requirements. You may also require a kitchen inspection to establish a food business and being able to sell food to the public. And then finally, they're going to be looking to see if you're using good manufacturing practices. And those include things like good personal hygiene, cleaning and sanitizing, and then proper food storage. So one last thing that you can add to your marketing of food safety at your farm stand is, since customers are really concerned about where their food is grown and how it's grown, you may want to post a sign like the one on the right that says, "Ask me about my food safety practices." This sign would show your customers that you really are committed to food safety and you are trying your best to handle food as safely as possible. So in summary, remember that your customers do trust your product is safe. And to make sure that you do keep your product safe, you want to practice good personal hygiene. Hand washing is one of the most important things you can do to keep food safe and prevent cross-contamination. You also want to make sure everything is cleaned and sanitized, whether it's your containers that you're selling your produce in, or your knives and utensils that you're using to prepare samples. You want to make sure they're cleaned and sanitized. And then also, if you are serving cold foods or hot foods, make sure you keep your cold foods cold and your hot foods hot. If you'd like more information or have questions about food safety at the farmer's market, you can contact me at alice.mullen@unh.edu, or you can also go to our extension website and download information and fact sheets on food safety.